U.S. foreign policy today has officially adopted a position of genocide.
So when those revolutionaries in 1979 are toppling the Shah's regime, they were also toppling America.
No, absolutely. There was a sense that Iranians effectively were under some sort of neo-imperial rule.
I'm wondering, though, if Americans didn't fully understand what Iranians meant when they said death to America.
It meant death to imperialism, death to American foreign policy that toppled democracy in Iran and installed a brutal dictator, death to our subjugation and our humiliation as a country and a civilization.
A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. However, now that we have complete and total regime change, where different, smarter, and less radicalized minds prevail, maybe something revolutionarily wonderful can happen. Who knows? We'll find out tonight. When you heard and read what the President of the United States, Donald Trump, said, as an Iranian, as an academic, as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., what was going through your mind?
The thought that occurred to me was that U.S. foreign policy today has officially adopted a position of genocide. All of us were waiting until that 8 o'clock deadline. I was very much convinced he was going to follow through in some manner. Thankfully, it didn't happen, but it could happen again because this issue is not resolved.
What does that tell us that even a U.S. president would be capable of saying such a thing?
It comes from 1979.
There was a before 1979. We need to go back a number of decades. So maybe we can start by even just talking about 1953.
The United States, with support from the United Kingdom, staged a coup d'etat to topple a democratically oriented government that was in power.
So Mohammad Mossadegh, popular leader, democratically elected, he believed that Iran should be in control of its own resources.
And that claim was shocking and deeply offensive to, first and foremost, the United Kingdom, because it was the United Kingdom, the British Petroleum Oil Company, that had set up and established the oil production facilities in Iran, and they were reaping the profits. The nationalist forces had this idea that this oil belongs to us, and we need to renegotiate the terms of the relationship with the British Petroleum Company. They viewed that as a threat. The United States viewed it as a threat. The real fear was independent nationalism, and the idea that if someone with Mohammad Mossadegh were to consolidate power, what would that then mean for American and Western interests throughout the broader Middle East? So that's why he was toppled.
The CIA plays a role in this. What happened next in Iran?
Iran falls under the reign of this authoritarian ruler.
You're talking about the Shah.
I'm talking about the Shah of Iran. Yeah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose son lives outside of Washington, D.C., and now wants to return to continue that legacy. The consequences of that coup d'etat produce a shift in Iran's political culture. Oppositional politics gradually shifts in the realm of religion and in a more conservative direction because all of the secular options are basically eradicated. There's no free press, there's no political parties. People are either in jail, in prison, or they've fled the country. The Shah's regime was synonymous with this organization called SAVAK, which was the internal intelligence organization that would arrest, monitor, exile, and torture people. Amnesty International described the regime of the Shah in 1975 as one of the worst human rights violators in the world.
And yet, when he went to the United States, he was seen as being an example of Iranian possibility.
He was considered to be the embodiment of the type of political ruler that the West would like to see replicated in other parts of the not just Middle East, but the developing world. He was the protector of American interests in the context of the Cold War. He had a good relationship with Israel that was blossoming. And he spoke the language of modernization, development. But of course, he was saying all those things rhetorically to a Western audience. Internally, he was not only very repressive, but he was also corrupt. Iran was making a lot of money as a result of the sale of oil, but that money was not being equally distributed. This is one of the causes of the revolution.
1979 is often described as the Islamic Revolution. But this was a popular revolution.
It was a revolution that inspired for political freedom, critically political independence from the United States, and for a just society. Leftist politics were very popular in Iran at this time, particularly among young people. And then you had a spectrum of religious forces, many of them who looked to Ayatollah Khomeini as sort of the inspirational leader. Khomeini presented himself as this humble, deeply devout religious person who was challenging political power and lived very humbly on a diet of yogurt and raisins in contrast to the affluence of the Shah of Iran, living in his affluent palace, reportedly with a gold toilet, sitting on the nation's wealth. And so the contrasting image that people had in the lead up to the revolution were basically these two images.
So when those revolutionaries in 1979 are toppling the Shah's regime, they were also toppling America.
No, absolutely. There was a sense that Iranians effectively were under some sort of neo-imperial rule.
And that they'd been betrayed by the United States.
Not only betrayed, but their dignity as people exploited, that their natural wealth, the oil, was basically taken out of their land because of the Shah that was backed by the United States, that they were poorer off, they were less developed because of this equation that had taken place. So you can't understand the Iranian Revolution without understanding what I would argue was the legitimate grievances that Iranians had toward the United States. When Donald Trump announced the war in February, he began by listing all the grievances that the United States had toward Iran. And he begins by talking about the seizure of the American embassy in November 1979. That's sort of a baffling development for a lot of people because they don't understand why anyone would seize a diplomatic staff and an embassy and hold them in violation of international law for 444 days. That just makes no sense. If you look at it from the perspective of Iranians, from the bottom up, they were looking at the United States as the key supporter, backer, sustainer of a brutal monarch who was installed against the wishes of the Iranian people, thwarting a democratic movement in 1953, and held in power and supported by not just the United States, but by the West. Iranian revolutionaries would respond back to the United States, yes, we did take these hostages, but the United States took us hostage for 25 years because of that 53 coup and because of the support they gave to the former dictator.
I remember how deeply traumatic this event in Iran was for Americans to see the way in which these American officials were being treated at that time. I'm wondering, though, if Americans fully appreciate that anger that Iranians felt and maybe didn't fully understand what Iranians meant when they said death to America. From your vantage point as a scholar, as someone who kind of understands this moment, what does that term, death to America, mean to you?
It meant death to imperialism, death to American foreign policy that toppled democracy in Iran and installed a brutal dictator, death to our subjugation and our humiliation as a country and a civilization. It doesn't mean death to every American citizen, death to American democracy or human rights. In fact, many Iranians would argue back then that we want some of that stuff for us. And the problem is the hypocrisy of the United States that has robbed us of our democracy and of our human rights. In a revolutionary moment, slogans that often get articulated are often not the best slogans in terms of public relations.
Death to the IDF! Death to the IDF!
If you really want to understand any part of the world, you have to understand it from the perspective of people living in that part of the world. If you were a typical Iranian citizen living in Iran whose political identity had been shaped by the events that we're talking about in the post-1953 period, you'd be very angry with the United States. In fact, if you weren't angry with the United States, I would say there'd be something wrong with you, because that would be the legitimate, natural sort of response to the humiliation, to the subjugation, to the dictatorship, and to the, tyrannical rule of the Shah that was very much at the foundation of the 1979 revolution.